We're going to go ahead and get started now. On behalf of the California Technology Agency, I'd like to welcome everybody to our Navigating the Narrowband Mandate breakout session from this conference. I'm Karen Wong, Deputy Director, Public Safety Communications Office. The purpose of the forum is to address all the concerns and issues you may have as the audience regarding the narrowbanding mandate. I wanted to read something I took off of the FCC website just to kind of set the stage for today. On January 1, 2013, all public safety and business industrial land mobile radio systems operating in the 150, 512 megahertz radio bands must cease operating using 25 kilohertz efficiency technology and begin operating using at least 12.5 kilohertz efficiency technology. This deadline is the result of an FCC effort that began almost 2 decades ago to ensure more efficient use of the spectrum and greater spectrum access for the public safety and non-public safety users. Migration to the 12.5 kilohertz efficiency technology will allow the creation of additional channel capacity within the same radio spectrum and support more users. After January 1, 2013, licensees not operating at the 12.5 kilohertz efficiency will be in violation of the Commission's rules and could be subject to FCC enforcement action, which may include abolishment, monetary fines, or loss of license. As of today, we have 662 days to complete the narrowbanding efforts. I didn't add the hours and the seconds. It stressed me out just a little bit. But I do want to make that point. The days are numbered. So what we've done today is put a panel together, and we're very fortunate to have the panel members that we have. We have David Firth from the Federal Communications Commission, Deputy Bureau Chief, Public Safety and Homeland Security. Brendan Murphy, Director, Grants Management, California Emergency Management Agency. Charles Preston Thompson, Association of Public Safety Communications Officials, better known as APCO, and Kim Pimlott, Acting Director for CAL FIRE. Today's agenda includes a short presentation from each of the panel members, and then we'll proceed with questions. And what we've done is we've asked you guys to provide questions in advance. So we will go through those questions in each of the 3 categories, which is funding, technology, and coordination. After we go through the questions submitted in advance, we'll open it up if you have any of the questions in those categories, and then move to the next category. I'd like this to be informal and interactive because the reason we're here today with the panel members that we have is to provide you whatever you need to meet the narrowbanding mandate. So we'll start with the first presentation from David Firth from FCC.
Great, thank you. And then I can just... Afternoon, everybody. I guess for those of you in the room, as you can see, we're putting the presentation slides up on the side wall rather than the back wall. So some of you sort of on this side of the room might want to switch over to the other side if you want to get a better look at the slides. This is actually the same presentation that's on our webpage, so I'm just going to kind of go through it quickly and try to emphasize a few points, highlight a few points from that. So if you want to look at it, at your leisure, you can also go to the FCC's narrowbanding webpage and see the same deck. In any event, I am glad to be here as Deputy Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. I'm in charge of the team at the FCC that is dealing with narrowbanding specifically for public safety licensees. I would mention that we also have people in our Wireless Bureau and our Office of Engineering and Technology that are also involved in narrowbanding because, as many of you may know, narrowbanding doesn't not just apply to public safety, it actually applies to all land mobile radio licensees that are in the bands in question. So let's kind of get started. Do I press the middle button? The right button. Sorry?
I believe it's the right button.
All right, let's see. I probably have a pointer the wrong way. There we go. Okay, so just going to start with some narrowbanding basics. Let me ask how many of the people, at least in the room, are with licensees that are currently in, well, first that are subject to the narrowbanding requirement. Okay. How many of those licensees have already narrowbanded? Okay, well, got a couple. That's good. How many are in the process of narrowbanding? Okay, that's encouraging. How many have equipment that is narrowband capable? Okay, all right. So we've got a good cross-section here. And some of this, I'll go through this fairly quickly. Some of this may be familiar to you, but just for anybody for whom it is not, because the deadline is coming up in less than 2 years, we want to be sure that everybody, both here in the room and in our web audience, is fully aware of these requirements. So to start, as Karen already summarized what the requirement is, it's a requirement that applies to all public safety and industrial business licensees in the VHF and UHF bands that have been dedicated to land mobile for many years. And one thing I would note is that some of those industrial business licensees are actually public sector licensees, because if they don't necessarily meet the qualifications for the public safety pool, we know that there are a number of government agencies, things like school systems and public work systems and things like that sometimes have the business industrial licenses. Those are the ones that are subject to the requirement, and as is already mentioned, the requirement is to migrate from 25 kilohertz to 12.5 kilohertz, or the equivalent, by January 1st, 2013. What are the benefits of narrowbanding? There are a number of benefits. The reason that the Commission started this many years ago was to ensure more efficient use of the spectrum and more spectrum access on bands where channels were becoming very congested. And that's one of the reasons that narrowbanding, though it's obviously a burden for everyone, has been consistently supported by the public safety community, including national public safety organizations. The deadlines, we have talked about the January 1st, 2013 deadline. There were also some elements of the narrowbanding requirement that actually kicked in this past January. We have an interim deadline which applies to any new system or expansion of an existing system. So if you have an existing wideband system but you want to expand it, the rules require that any new facilities be narrowbanded, that you can no longer get licensed for wideband facilities, new facilities. And we're also no longer certifying equipment that includes a 25 kilohertz mode in the equipment. There is still a lot of dual mode equipment out there. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But at this point, anything new needs to be 12.5 only. You think this is a useful slide to give us some perspective on the timeline, because this tells us kind of where we've been and where we are now. Way off at the left, back in the mid-1990s, is when the original narrowbanding rules were adopted. Then that was in 1995. And then in 1997 was when 12.5 kilohertz equipment began to become available. Then in 2004, the Commission announced the January 2013 deadline. And now we are sort of a little bit past the dotted line where the interim deadline is and headed towards the final deadline. But the important thing here is narrowbanding has been out there for a long time, and the reasons underlying the requirement have also been out there for a long time. So why is the deadline important? There are a number of things that make it important. One is that after January 1st, 2013, our interference rules are not going to protect wideband systems from harmful interference. In addition, there are concerns that systems that fail to narrowband by that deadline could create interference or interoperability problems for those that already have narrowbanded. And then, again, wideband equipment is no longer going to be available. So we're really moving down a path where the technology is migrating to 12.5. Many systems already have migrated, and we now have to complete this process in order to be sure that everybody is operating in narrowband mode. Question we often get asked is, will the deadline be extended? The answer is no. The Commission, in an order last year, reaffirmed the 2013 deadline, and there is no prospect of that 2013 deadline being extended. So then the next question is typically, well, if we think we're going to need more time, can we come and get a waiver? You can come and ask for a waiver. But those of you who are familiar with our waiver policies know that in order to justify a waiver, you have to show unique facts and circumstances. You have to make a very compelling showing. And so these waivers are not routinely granted, and we don't expect that they will be routinely granted in this case any more than in any other type of case where we're presented with waivers. What we are encouraging licensees to do who have concerns about the timeline, and we know there are many who do, rather than just coming in and filing a waiver, what we are encouraging licensees to do is come and talk to us. And I'll talk a little bit later about how that process works, because we've already been engaged in it with many licensees. In addition, if you're engaged in this process and you haven't already started the planning and preparation that's necessary, it's very late in the game, but it's essential to start that process now. What we want to avoid is licensees who come in and it's summer of 2012 and they suddenly say, oh gee, we just realized there was this narrowbanding mandate that we got to meet in 6 months, and sorry, we haven't done anything. That is a very bad situation for any licensee to find themselves in, and they will not get a very sympathetic ear at the FCC. And I suspect from their fellow licensees either, because again, this is an issue where everybody doing this matters to everybody else. So it's not just what benefits you get with your own system, but sort of how all these systems interoperate and interact. Another issue that I think we can get out of the way fairly quickly is, as many of you are probably aware, narrowbanding is actually 2 phases. This is the first phase, which is from 25 kilohertz to 12.5 kilohertz. And then the narrowbanding program has always contemplated that there would be a second phase that would migrate us from 12.5 to 6.25 kilohertz. So basically taking all of those original channels, first you divide them in half and then you divide them in quarters. The key things to understand about that is there is in the rules a contemplated phase 2, but there is no deadline. The FCC has not set a deadline, and in fact the FCC has said we will not set a deadline without a further rulemaking. So at this point we are very focused on 2013 and 12.5 kilohertz. We are not focused on 6.25, and my personal view on that is that that is something that is a long ways off. There is equipment that is being developed that has 6.25 capability, and we want to encourage that development. But there are many other things going on in the public safety world and with spectrum and with broadband. So our focus is really on getting the 2013 phase 1 done, and then we'll see where we are. But what that means is we certainly encourage licensees who want to move to 6.25 to do so. And we're going to encourage the further development of equipment, but you're not faced with an immediate prospect that once you've gotten to 12.5, we're going to turn around and drop another deadline on you and say, okay, now you have to go to 6.25. How to prepare? Prepare now, and really now is you should have prepared before. Some of the other panelists, I think, can address some of the issues, because I know that some of the other panelists actually represent licensees that have gone through the process. And what we're really emphasizing here is that the first thing you need to do is figure out how narrowbanding is going to affect your system, because how it plays out for any licensee depends on what system, what equipment they're using now. As a general rule, the more likely you're going to have an issue is if you have older equipment that's from the wideband only days that is not dual mode. Virtually any equipment that's been made available in the last decade should be dual mode. That doesn't necessarily deal with all of the issues, but that deals with many of the issues. So looking at your existing equipment, examining the issue of whether additional sites will be needed to maintain the coverage, and we can come back to that issue. I know that's one of the questions on the list. Working with your neighbors, and this is really important. And one of the things that we're encouraged to see is that as we go and we do outreach to licensees, to states, to the interoperability coordinators, even with the regional planning committees who are not actually directly responsible for this, but many of the same people are involved in the narrowbanding process. What we're encouraging is everybody needs to talk to their neighbors and look at how to coordinate efforts, because you get into difficulties if you have a staggered transition where a licensee in one community narrowbands and then their neighbor doesn't, and there's a time lag between the two. So interoperability relationships and all those types of implications, it's better to look at those early, and I think that also makes for a stronger presentation to the commission if you're in a position where you're going to need to come to us with a waiver request. We have one way, the only waiver request we have in right now that's been filed was filed by 3 counties in the St. Louis region, and they filed on a coordinated basis because they have a comprehensive plan for the metropolitan area. They're actually migrating to 800 megahertz. They've got funding in place, including local funding that they've been able to generate through local initiatives, which is really extraordinary when you think about the kind of budgetary climate we're all in. So they have a plan, and they're migrating to many of their systems to 800 on a region-wide basis. They are saying they're going to need some extra time to do that, but there is a plan in place. We have not acted on that waiver request, but I think it gives you an idea of the kind of thinking that has gone in, that can go in and should go into these types of requests. It's a lot easier to look at this issue if we're looking at all of the relevant systems and licensees in the region as opposed to them just coming in piecemeal. Very important to develop a compliance plan. I think that it's going to be very difficult for the commission to consider a waiver request that doesn't have a timeline and doesn't have some discussion of funding. We'll talk about funding because I know that that's going to be a sticking point for many of you, again, given the climate that we're in. But there needs to be a timeline, there needs to be a budget. These are the things that can't be thought of at the last minute. They really have to be part of your planning. Because, again, the first question we're going to ask is, if you come in for a waiver, the first question we're going to ask is, well, what have you been doing? Where are you now? How much are you going to be able to get accomplished by the deadline? And that requires planning and getting your ducks in a row. And as I said before, contacting the Bureau with questions and concerns. Real quickly, you can go through this. We've already talked about it a little bit in terms of the availability of narrowband equipment. It's been widely available for a long time, and obviously a part of the due diligence process is to talk to your vendor, work with your vendor to determine whether the equipment that you have can be narrowbanded in place or whether it needs to be replaced. Funding considerations. I'm sure some of the other panelists will be talking about this as well. The cost of narrowbanding is going to vary a lot depending on the nature of the existing system. One thing to keep in mind is narrowbanding itself does not require a system upgrade. Narrowbanding requires narrowbanding. There are many licensees who are using narrowbanding as an opportunity to do other things. For example, convert from analog to digital, perhaps move out of the band, go to P25. None of those are required by the narrowbanding mandate, but it can be an opportunity to look at other issues. In general, the reality is that all of the systems out there are aging. They're going to have to be replaced at some point or upgraded at some point. This is an opportunity as well as a challenge to look at those issues and figure out if this is the time to do it. And then we'll talk about funding, and we've got some information about funding, and I know that we also have some other panelists who I think can talk about that. Modifying of licenses to reflect narrowbanding. We're still working through some of the details on this, but a couple of things to just keep in mind. We recommend that licensees modify their license to add a narrowband emission designator prior to commencing operations. That doesn't mean you need to add it before you start any work to convert or upgrade your system, but before it's going to actually commence operations in 12.5 kilohertz mode, you need to put a narrowband designator on the license. That does not mean you need to get rid of the wideband designator, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It is perfectly acceptable to have both on the license, and many licensees do. And This is actually, the second bullet is one that we're actually looking at possibly changing, because I know that this is a question that's come up, which is once the narrowband transition is complete, what happens to the wideband emission designator? Because I know that there's a lot of concern out there about, gee, are we going to have to come in and get the modification? And if so, isn't the FCC going to be flooded with applications? And and how long is it going to take to get all of that done? We're looking at some options now for simply taking the wideband designator off at the transition point, unless a licensee tells us that there is a reason not to do that. I mean, if a licensee has a waiver, then we wouldn't take the wideband designation off. Also, there may be some instances, one of the sort of details of the narrowbanding rule is that you can meet the rule either by narrowbanding 12.5 kilohertz or by operating with equivalent efficiency, which means it's theoretically possible that you could keep the wideband designator but demonstrate to us that you're operating with the equivalent efficiency of a 12.5 kilohertz channel. In which case, again, if we take the wideband designator off, then that is something that the licensee would need to alert us to so that we don't do that inadvertently. Now, we're working through some internal issues at this point, because one of the things that the FCC is doing is it's converting from our old licensing database to our new licensing database at some point in the next few years. I think at this point, though, it's unlikely that's going to occur before the 2013 deadline. And therefore, we are likely to make whatever changes we need to make within the existing universal licensing system. But we're looking for ways to streamline that process, both from a licensee perspective and also from an FCC staff resources perspective. And what I can tell you is that as we make those decisions, we will be putting out public notices and making that part of our outreach, so that we will have guidance for you well before 2013, to the extent that there's any uncertainty now on these issues. We don't want to, if we can avoid a flood of last-minute applications just to basically document in the licensing database what has occurred and what is supposed to occur, and can simply make those changes internally and then put them on the database, then that's what we'll do. Frequency coordination, and Preston will be able to give the coordinator's perspective on this. One change that the Commission made in its rules last year was to clarify that frequency coordination is not required for the addition of the narrowband designator or the removal of the wideband designator, if that's the only thing you are doing, if you are changing nothing else in your system parameters in the license. Obviously, if you are changing anything else, then coordination would be required. And also very important for, now I guess with the California audience, Canadian coordination may not be important, but on the assumption there might be some folks from other states, the Canadian coordination point is also important. That again, if all you're doing is reducing your bandwidth, it does not require Canadian coordination. Finally, additional information and resources. Two of the people on my staff, Roberto Mussenden, who's actually at IWCE right now talking about this very same subject, and Zenji Nakazawa are our principal contacts. Many of you probably have already talked to them. If you haven't, those are their emails and direct dial numbers. They said it was okay for me to put them on this slide. So they are contacts that we can make sure get you the answers you need, even if we need to go to other parts of the Commission to get them. We've also established a narrowbanding mailbox with email questions, and what we do is we try to respond to those questions, but we also then take the questions and put them into an updated FAQ on our website. And then the Bureau website, and specifically the narrowbanding portion of the website, then some other resources. These are some of the public safety organizations that are also very involved with the narrowbanding process. And there are a whole host of them, and we've been working very closely with them, with NIPSTIC, with IMSA, with the police chiefs, fire chiefs, all of the different organizations to do outreach. There's also a SAFECOM committee, that is a task force that is working on narrowbanding. So there are a number of resources that you can get from these websites and also from the organizations themselves. And then we have some links to some of the federal resources. We don't have anybody on this panel today from any of the federal grant funding agencies, so I have to be a little careful about speaking for them. But what I can say is that we have been working with our federal partners to try to make sure that the information about the availability of funding and how to go through that process is provided across the board, is consistent, so that licensees have an easy access into that information. And I think that is it. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to the other panelists, and I'll look forward to questions.
Okay. And our next panel member to talk will be Brendan Murphy.
Hi, how is everybody this afternoon? So,
Good.
Anybody? Okay. So I may be the only person in the room who has no idea what narrowbanding was, except you cut something in half. So I am a numbers guy, so I appreciated the quarters and the half references, and that was about it. Actually, if you don't mind going back to your last slide,
Oh, can I?
you can go back to the
Yeah.
this actually be some of what we talked about. So thanks for doing a slide, because I didn't. So I'm Brendan Murphy. I'm the Director of Grants Management at the California Emergency Management Agency, which roughly means I'm responsible for about $4 billion of that DHS FEMA money inside the state of California, and only about $290 million of the DOJ money. So I think they have less, so we'll make myself feel better that way. As just to kind of give you a quick overview, there has been a lot of work, I think, to make narrowbanding an eligible grant expense, and in some cases it worked out better than in others. Most of it has been done under or with some very specific words. So those of you who as I get into more specifics, I think you understand more, but the best buzz phrase ever is interoperability, or upgrade to make yourself P25 compliant in the future. So, of which none of that is defined, just to be clear. So there is no definition of future, there's no definition of interoperability issues. It's just nice wording that you actually make some grant person like myself sitting in DC feel better. So we believe me, we like to feel better. It's better about ourselves. So you know, the part of the way that some of these came about is way back when they were writing grant rules, the federal government and especially Congress decided that they would tie people's hands, because clearly Congress knows what we should all be doing 10 years later. And in that, only one laugh? I'm a little sad about that. In that, if you look up here at the top of the chart, the Office of Emergency Communications, which is a newer function inside of DHS, but SAFECOM and the writing of SAFECOM rules was really guided by what was put in a bill in 2004. So if you think back to 2004 and whatever systems you were using and whatever your radio was and however you were doing it, if it's exactly the same, then SAFECOM should be perfect for you. So Ken is right on cue. That's the beauty of being in the state of California, is we're there. Although not everybody kept their world that way. So what we have is that in some very specific instances, you can qualify for narrowbanding funding if you use those specific words. The reality of it is, if you're talking P25 compliance or interoperability with a neighbor and some other focuses like that, there's a little bit broader way to qualify for funding that clearly is you upgrading in some narrowbanding issues. So with that, I'm going to kind of quickly run through some of the grants, which most of them aren't up there, but one of them is. So the first grant, which kind of dovetails the one that is up there, is the Public Safety Interoperable Communications Grant. Those of you who haven't heard the acronym, it's PSIC. I love acronyms because it gives me something to do at night with my kids. They get tests every night. Got to know those acronyms, otherwise they can't talk to me. So with PSIC, it kind of it led into the one that is up there, the Interoperable Emergency Communications Grant Program. If I could speak, we'd know what it was. And that's that actually has a longer acronym than the name. So, but when you were looking at that, and when the Department of Homeland Security kind of reviewed what those qualifications were, those all fell under a statute that was written in 2002 that requires them to be P25 compliant while moving forward without an exemption. So just so you know, I mean, I want to be clear, that I have no idea what that really means. So somebody on this panel, I'm sure, could tell you. But the P25, or Michael Cruz, who's over there, he only has one hand to lift up, but I'm going to make him lift it up. He can tell you what it means. He can tell you what it means. But he's who I go to when he looks at me and goes, "Well, how come you have that dumbfounded look on your face?" Because I have no idea what I'm talking about. But I know how to get money. The P25 compliance issue is what, without a waiver, I mean, when it falls under, if you can imagine Homeland Security grants as a whole, pretty much everything runs as being P25 compliant. If you're getting interoperable funds, they want you to be P25 compliant. We have a few waivers that you can get based on legacy system issues, interoperability issues, and that's really about it. There is not, so I guess let me stick on this subject first. That kind of covers what is the Public Safety Interoperable Communications Program, which is kind of defunct now because it was based on selling bandwidth. The Interoperable Emergency Communications Grant Program, which is funded yearly, and the Homeland Security Grant Program, which encompasses an awful lot of money given to local areas as well as states. And in that, the real goal of any interoperability is to be P25 compliant. They made that very clear up front. That's a 2002/2004 mandate. And so anything that's hinged on increasing your funding for narrowbanding has to be fit inside that idea of increasing your capacity to be P25 compliant. Now that I've told you how to defeat the rules, some of the things that go direct, I don't know how many local agencies are in the room, but some of the things that go direct to local agencies that help with narrowbanding, especially on the public safety side, the burn JAG direct grants, that's an eligible qualification. I know if there are any police agencies in the room, most of you use those to pay for officers, so good luck trying to get your chief to change that. And then the other one that is part of DOJ, in addition to NIJ, which has a direct, that's actually so maybe the only grant program in all of government outside of FCC that actually is for narrowbanding, is that one at NIJ. The other side is Burn JAG actually has a communications enhancement grant. So that's the Edward R. Just so those of you who like to write, the Edward R. Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant, run by the United States Department of Justice, has a competitive program that is for communications enhancement for public safety law enforcement. So, and in that purpose, again, you kind of have to dress it up as P25, but narrowbanding is one of the eligible applicable rules. From what I could tell from the scoring, I actually participated in the scoring there, that was not something that was looked upon favorably in the scoring process. So again, I suggest if you are going to apply, you dress it up as P25 compliant, because that scored much higher. And so, I mean, that's kind of a broad strokes. Now I hate to give you the sad reality. Now that I've given you all these grant program names, the reality is it is very, very competitive. And I mean, you're talking about massive competitiveness inside of, do we buy, at a local level, do we buy a bomb robot, or do we focus on what our communications issues are? And, some of your smaller counties are really, really tied. If you're getting $125,000, it's great to have $125,000 in non-matched money, but you need to really make a commitment as to if it's going to take $2.5 million to upgrade my system. That's a lot of $125,000 before you get to $2.5 million. So this is very competitive funding, but at both the state and local level, and because of that, I would say generally, I hate to discourage anybody, but generally you're gonna run into some walls along the way when looking at grant funding as a means to meet the narrowbanding guidelines, without maybe the lone exception of there being that bottom bullet for DOJ and their narrowbanding specific grant, which is a competitive nationwide grant. So when you get to this, the good and bad of it is that I think there are ways to do some of it. I would highly, I just kind of want to give you a realistic perspective that I don't think anybody in this room can walk into the chief now and say, hey, why don't we use this year's Burn JAG direct money to pay for narrowbanding? Unless you want to give them a laugh, and then in which case I encourage you. But then I think that's kind of where it's at. So for those of you that are looking for funds and maybe have a shot at some interop money or some along the way, I highly encourage you to use some classic buzzwords: P25, interoperability issues with neighbors or neighboring entities. Those are all very, very well looked upon phrases in the world of making these things eligible expenditures. Sue's smiling because I used to teach her how to write all this stuff. So with that, I think we'll be happy to answer questions later, but unfortunately it's not a lot. I mean, I'd love to tell you that there's a pot of money for this and we've got it and here it is, and it's just not there. All right, on with the good news.
Thanks for all the help.
Yeah.
And you're here why?
Yeah, I'll be here all week. Thanks. Don't forget to tip your waitress.
Our next panel presentation is by Charles Preston Thompson, APCO.
What I'm going to say somewhat echoes what Dave has said handily in the slides. There is a provision to add narrowband emission to your licenses on your own through the ULS radio system. If you're timid at heart, I would suggest you not do that. There are some irregularities and a learning curve for processing license applications on that system. If you fall in the latter category, the frequency coordinators in the industry, APCO is one of them, IMSA, International Municipal Signal Association, FCCA, AASHTO, all provide the narrowband emission services at a minimum cost on the order of $25 per call sign. So if you don't want to get into the thick of it, that's an alternative for you. But I will caution, if you go into the process on your own, that yes, you may add narrowband, but if you are licensed for analog wideband, you may only add analog narrowband. If you are licensed for wideband digital, you may add narrowband digital. Adding P25 to an analog license will cause the license system to fail your application. It'll either be returned or it'll be dismissed. You may make some administrative changes while you're in the system. For instance, you might catch an area code on the control point telephone number, or a post office box that is changed on the mailing address, or the attention to line bears the name of a person that retired 20 years ago. And that's caused any number of difficulties if you don't keep the license up current. Through the process of narrowbanding, though, there are several steps that you must take. Of course, you can just blather into it if you wish, but those that have given some thought to the process, your first step is to do an inventory. Do an inventory of your equipment to determine what is to be replaced and what is narrowband capable. Now, since we've been planning for this over 2 decades, and most everything made since 1997 is narrowband compatible, you may not have such a budget fright as you perhaps imagine at the moment. Second is to do an inventory of your neighbors, those that would be intermittently on your radio system from time to time. Such illustrations would be on a fire radio system where your local ambulance company comes on the channel to work a call with the fire unit. You may have tow trucks come on your law channel to coordinate removal of a disabled vehicle. So identify your neighbors, and when you get your planning together to do the narrowband switch, they are informed and know not to cooperate and concurrently change to narrowband. Within your planning, there's what's known as a flash cut, where you bring a dozen technicians in, depending on the size of your system, to make the conversions in a couple of hours, maybe 4 hours. You plan this during your downtime or your minimum traffic moments, you wouldn't want to do it on a police channel on a Friday evening. A Monday or a Tuesday evening would work fine. Or you may need to consider an incremental cut where you've got units spread all over a couple of counties, where you can do your narrow banding conversion in islands of activity. 30 units here, 20 units there. Pretty soon the job is done. I speak for APCO at this particular event. Having done frequency coordination work for 25 years and having done licensing work for over 50 years, we're starting to see a lot of narrowband ramp-ups on the order of 3 or 4 applications a day. So the coordinators are pitching in to assist you and enable the process to go as smoothly as it can be done. Okay.
Okay, thank you. And then our final presentation is from Kim Pimlott, Acting Director for CAL FIRE.
Thanks, Karen. Well, because at CAL FIRE we're made up of a bunch of overachievers, we...
He's our success story.
That's right. Well, it didn't come easily, but we, like human nature, I think, as was pointed out, we knew this was coming as early as the mid-90s, but like everybody else, we don't tend to do things until we know we have to do it. So I think a lot of us lost a lot of time, although this has been we knew it was on the radar screen, and our staff had the foresight to build a plan that tried to get us into compliance 2 to 3 years before the 2013 deadline, knowing that once we implemented, we would have challenges and the bumps in the road and what needed to work out. So the key that we found, and this is where the fire service in California, again, we've evolved through the series of hard knocks, but we learned that governance is the key to any of this. And for those that know about Fire Scope, firefighting resources in California organized for potential emergencies, that Fire Scope group was developed in the early 70s as a result of some very significant fire years, particularly in 1970, when we found in particular that fire departments weren't communicating with each other, had different systems, different frequencies, and lots of other things that were different. When that group put together, the goal was, it started in Southern California, but moving out throughout the whole state, was to get us in a common operating picture. One of the aspects being a common radio plan for the entire state. So our goal from the beginning in bringing in and implementing narrowbanding was we were going to use Fire Scope as the governance structure to implement narrowbanding, because it really isn't just about CAL FIRE, although we are the commonality or the glue, if you will, across all of California from a wildland fire perspective. We interact with all 900 plus fire departments throughout the state every day. So what we do, we need to be doing it with the rest of the fire service. So as we did this, the key was governance under Fire Scope and then coordination with all of the involved partners out there from the fire service, but our federal partners, Forest Service, others, the other state agencies, corrections, but in particular, well, at the time DGS, but now CTA under the Public Safety Communications Division. It was key that all of those folks had to be engaged up front. So initially, we put in a budget change proposal request in 2004, and obviously, like we talked about today, had we been doing this under today's climate, this would not have happened. But in 2004, things were a bit different, and we were approved for a 5-year budget change proposal that ran from 2005 to 2010 for a total over the 5 years of $12.5 million. And for CAL FIRE, this meant over 310 repeater sites, 3,000 mobile units, 5,000 portable radios or handy-talkies, and over 350 facilities, fire stations, air attack bases, conservation camps. So we had a significant volume of resources just within CAL FIRE that we needed to change over using the budget change proposal, the money from that. But at the same time, we needed to coordinate that changeover with all of our cooperators within each of our 21 units throughout the state. The starting point of the project was the procurement of radios that were, one, P25 compliant, and establishing contracts for particularly the repeaters and the control stations. And same thing that we talked about, this was an opportunity where we could to not just look at the narrowbanding compliance, but to where we could to start the P25 changeover, where, again, where monies were available. And the challenge here was that P25 didn't come in until later on, and much of our portable and mobile radios had already been purchased in earlier years, and so we didn't have that P25 capacity initially. So we were doing this narrowbanding change-out with radios that had been purchased that didn't meet that. The future goal, though, is we will be continuing a change-out to meet P25. So in 2005, with the funding, we began upgrading and initiating that in our radio systems throughout the department. In 2008, when the P25 compliance came, we needed to go back in. And actually, when you're on, we found ourselves on the cutting edge of a lot of this. A lot of other departments hadn't quite gotten there yet, certainly not to the volume that we were at. And what we found is we started in the R&D component, if you will, with vendors, because we were asking for radio systems that they really hadn't proven or tested yet. So we were kind of on that cutting edge. So we lost between 6 and 12 months as we went back and forth with the vendors, with them developing a radio that would meet our needs in the field. And with the communications network and structure that we have. We overcame that, put ourselves back on track, had a radio package that was developed that worked for us, and then began to move down the road. By 2008, we had essentially completed all of the purchasing of the equipment. So we spent the first 2 years of our budget change or our funding getting the equipment purchased and in place. And again, it's the state system, state procurement process. So even when we knew what we wanted, it took another couple of years to actually figure out how to buy it. And by this time, the radios were obsolete and we had to start over. No, I'm just kidding. But I don't think, for all these that know, I think you all know the challenges we all face in trying to get this done. And again, 5-year window of a BCP, we've already eaten into 2 to 3 years of that. So we're starting again, even though we had this plan, we're already starting to work up against the clock. So again, moving forward, kind of flash forwarding in today, we're now in the 6th year of the rollout, and we did extend it 1 year because it pushed us back, again, because of a number of issues, particularly the purchasing, but just the challenges of rolling out a system statewide when you not only have to coordinate or do it for yourself, but you've got to coordinate with, almost 1,000 cooperators out there. And in the middle of this, we had 2 significant fire sieges. We had the 2007 fire siege down south, and then in 2008, we had the lightning siege. All of that throws back our process. Everybody gets diverted. Our schedule gets thrown off because folks are busy. So again, we're in the 6th year. To date, 98% of all the radio equipment has been installed. 2% of the equipment is in the emergency command centers. That's being held off until we can convert each of the units completely. And a lot of this is key, you've got to do things in modules in order to convert everybody at once or go live once, and trying to figure out the size of that module and how that works. Once we've got the equipment and began converting the radios, actually implementing the process, we did in 2 phases. We did that beginning this last October. Phase 1 involved the complete narrowbanding of the first 14 of the 21 CAL FIRE units. And again, we have to do this based on the units that have lesser activity level during that time of the year. So we started in the north and central and are working south. So what we've done is we've now converted 14 of our 21 CAL FIRE units, and each of those units then convert with their local cooperators, so everybody in local government is converting at the same time. And again, all this done under the fire scope governance, so it's not just CAL FIRE saying that, it's the fire service accepting that converting. The challenge with that is now we've got 14 units in the north that are converted, but the remainder of our units are not. So you've got to leave some of your command channels and some of your other frequencies, your tactical frequencies need to be left wideband so they can continue to interact, because our engines go statewide. So we may have an engine in Humboldt that's going to end up in Southern California. We needed to maintain that capacity to communicate while at the same time converting as much as we could. We actually found, although it was feared there would be more problem, we actually found minimal problems with our wideband mobiles communicating with our narrowband mobiles. So they were able to communicate with each other even though they were both separate. So phase 2 of this now is beginning in April. We're going to complete the conversion of the remaining 7 CAL FIRE units. And then, of course, nothing's got to be easy. We have to go back to the 14 units in phase 1 because, again, FireScope produces once a year a statewide common radio plan. And every year, local government's updating frequencies, we're updating frequencies, and so are the federal agencies. Well, that new plan comes out every year about February. Well, we didn't have the time to convert all 21 units after the radio plan came out in the spring, so we had to do all the work we could do in the fall. Now move forward. In February, we're going to have to go back and reprogram the radio plan in those first 14 units, and then the remaining 7 units that we begin in April will have the entire conversion done, including the updated radio plan. So you can imagine the logistical coordination of trying to get all of this tied together and all this conversion happening with a goal of having it all done by June, because the idea here is, even though we're running incident activity all year, once we, as you know, once we get into the June months, we're starting into that higher level of activity with fire season, and that's not a good time for us to be dealing with this conversion. So we're on track to still do that. That's where we're headed, and again, we're working towards that. Again, CAL FIRE's coordinated this through FireScope and all our cooperating agencies. Many of the fire agencies decided to narrowband in conjunction with CAL FIRE to eliminate multiple reprogramming of radios. So again, because of our relationship with local government and the fire service, much of this is being done concurrently when we're doing one programming in everybody's radio packages. We are moving forward with dual licensing. We're going to continue to license wideband until everything converts at the January 1, 2013 deadline. That's going to work best for us. The key thing here, I think the lessons learned, obviously we learned a lot in the process. What we did find out, although challenging, the conversion to narrowband didn't create the crisis maybe or to the level that many of us feared. I think the same kind of syndrome happened with the Y2K change out. I know where we were all at and worried there. Yes, there were significant challenges in this conversion, but nothing that created any operational impacts that we couldn't overcome. We were also, it was thought during this process that we would lose coverage area from our transmitters by the narrowbanding. Most of the problems on coverage were mitigated by proper radio tuning. We took this opportunity, since we had to go back in and touch every radio anyway, is that we fine-tuned the tuning of the radios and the antennas so that they were right on frequency. And what we actually found is that some areas have actually reported increased coverage into some of the more remote areas that we work in. So in a way, this again caused us to go back in and look at our system and make some improvements that we may not have looked at this point if we hadn't done narrowbanding. There were some areas that lost coverage. It's not drastic, but those are certainly areas we're going to be able to work with and look at options to fix that. Again, talked about being on the cutting edge of technology. Because we were pushing the envelope, we had to spend some time helping vendors develop the radio systems that we needed that worked for us in our mission. Again, and that did cost us some time. We've had minimal complaints from the field. Again, the end users are always the first to tell us when things aren't working right. And obviously, when you're looking at public safety radio, the last thing that we need is to have people with the inability to communicate with each other. And so, again, we're any issues we have, we respond to those and fix them, and that helps us for the next rollout that we do. Probably the key thing here is, and I can't stress enough, is the modularizing the conversion, so that one is, if you have the ability to pick a small area first to see how it's going to work, build that module out, look at everything that you need to do within that area, that geographic area, and do it, find out what works, find out what doesn't, so then you can take it from there and roll it out. Unfortunately, we didn't have that option just because of how large an area the state is and needed to roll out, how integrated and integral the system is to itself across the state, the fact that our units are very transient across the entire state, and the time frame. We just had to do some trial and error as we went and fix it that way. Some of the things that I think that we did right, monthly coordinating meetings, particularly with DGS or the Public Safety Communications Group. Without being able to sit down at the table every month or periodically and figure out what was working and what wasn't, was critical. We didn't have surprises that way. We could address them up front. Everyone was on the same page with expectations. We shared results as progress was implemented, making adjustments as necessary. So again, the entire thing was a work in progress. We certainly didn't have all the ideas up front. We together needed to work through what the solutions were. Really need to pass along a real gratitude to the Public Safety Radio Group, because not only during this process were we trying to get this system rolled out, but as Karen talked about, they converted from DGS to the technology agency. So not only were we trying to roll this out, deal with other distractions, but again, she was trying to build and retool a shop right in the middle of all of this. Of course, the state budget hit, so there were furlough issues, so trying to get radio techs out there to help make this conversion became a problem. Travel restrictions, conflicting priorities. We weren't the only game in town. I know another big project was CHP and their Chippers program. That was a significant project. And so Karen and her shop balancing that workload, but very committed to making this a priority to meet our deadline, knowing that funding was going to go away. And labor challenges, to be able to have labor and management come together and allow some qualified CAL FIRE staff to help in programming and some of the installation to alleviate that process. And that was huge, and we know that those things don't come easily. I think the key, just to close, was it's all about governance. And again, it's all about establishing how it's going to go down and who's going to be responsible collectively, and then just getting together and the coordination, whatever it takes. But you've got to have the governance that's going to provide that structure from the beginning, or it won't work. So that's it.
Well, thank you very much. And we will be continuing working with all the other state agencies that do need to go forward with narrowbanding, and with the same commitment that we had to CAL FIRE on their narrowbanding, because it is important. So I know that we have 2 staff dedicated right now to work with the state agencies, and that's just what they're doing right now, exactly. And then we will move forward and do our best to make sure that everyone is able to meet this mandate. One of the messages that I do want to get out to the state agencies in the room: we can't wait till the very end, because if everybody waits till the very end, we do not have the resources to handle all of the needs in the last year. So we really need to be moving quickly on the narrowbanding issues for the state of California now. So I want to thank our panel members for their presentations, and so we will begin moving forward with the questions that we did receive in advance. The first question, I just have to say this, but it's truly been answered, is will the FCC consider extending the due date for narrowbanding? I think we're all pretty clear the answer is no, and so we need to be moving forward. The first segment is going to be regarding funding. Brandon did a really good job in letting us know what's out there as far as grants. Everyone knows what you have in your departments. So I will go through these questions, and then if you have any other questions regarding funding, we'll address those then. The first question we received in advance is: what financial assistance can the FCC provide to those governmental agencies that are financially strapped and cannot meet the deadline? I think that was answered, but I'll go ahead and...
Well, I mean, if the question is literally what financial assistance can the FCC itself provide, the answer is zero, because of course we can't, we are not a funding agency, and we are the licensing agency, and that is what we do. So our role with respect to funding is to try to get the information to you that Brendan has so ably summarized, if you don't have access to it directly, and then also to work in coordination with the agencies that do have programs that might provide funding. And I think we all recognize, as Brendan said, that grant programs are also limited, competitive. It's bad everywhere. I'm coming from the federal government, where the question around town is whether we'll be open for business in 3 weeks. So we also have our budget woes that I won't bore you with. But that's essentially our role. And I don't know, Brenda, if you want to maybe get past that question to perhaps what's also underlying it in terms of other assistance from other agencies.
I mean, I think that the biggest thing, I think kind of we did go through it, but the reality is that there's no, the the silver bullet really is on you to figure it out. I mean, I hate to say that, but it's true. And in these budget times, especially for the state agencies in the room inside the state, don't throw anything, but I came from finance once upon a time. The reality is you're not, there's no general fund in the foreseeable future. And by foreseeable future, I mean 5 years. So that, just doing the math, that takes you 3 years beyond the deadline. and even worse than that is the reality that, I mean, I think we are very competitive on everything we're doing here. And so when you're looking at, where your funding's coming from, it is an interesting plan. And for once now, the fact that what Ken left off is that he has the 2003 fire siege, which is really what won him a BCP in 2005.
Very true.
Is a Blue Ribbon Commission report that said they needed to actually be able to talk, which shockingly for those of you in the room, you would think that would have been a known thing from the beginning. But no, apparently it took people writing a report to actually know we should talk with each other. But so I think that ultimately, I mean, I hate to say it because there's not a lot of hope for looking outside the department. So it becomes, what can you do inside the department, and then maybe scrape together some of the more limited funding that you can get outside.
I mean, can I add something to that? And it's not necessarily.
No, I only made you raise your hand. I didn't say you could talk. God, what is it? Invite me and then talk over.
In regards to him not knowing what P25 is in Narrowbanding, because obviously he has other folks that know those things, specifically me. So. Yes, he is right. Obviously, it's dire, not just in California, but nationwide. But obviously, one of my sole purposes is to try and find funding for folks in the local jurisdictions, within the state agencies. Things like making sure we can try and get another PSIC extension, even though, it's due to expire. Well, everyone can hear me, right? It's due to expire, obviously, this September. So one of the things we at least try and do is say, well, can we see about getting an extension, at least for that existing grant? Gives us another additional year to use existing funding, make sure that funding gets to the actual agencies that can spend it and can use it and can meet the narrowband mandate. One of the other things is, appropriations for IECGP went through. So although not necessarily a lot of money, but it is some funding to help with planning and development and so forth. And there are stipulations that you can use that for equipment. However, there's some guidance that you need to meet before you can use that specific fund to purchase P25 narrowband compliant equipment. Now, one thing I just recently submitted Monday, even though I was on recuperating, is I just submitted and I've mentioned this to a lot of folks in this room, is HSGP 11, which we're still waiting for the guidance, but I just wrote up the IJ for it. Yeah. So obviously I put a lot of things in there that focuses on two things, two critical mandates. Obviously narrowband, made sure that was addressed, and also the other FCC mandate, which is not necessarily related to narrowband, but the mandate for EAS equipment, particularly for many of you who work in emergency EOS systems where you have EAS systems, and there's the FCC mandate that they have to be CAP compliant. So those are two critical mandates that I know, you've got one pot of money here where you need to do the narrowbanding, and you got another pot here where you go, well, which mandate do I follow? So hopefully whatever we can do, at least at the state level, we are trying to find as much money and be as creative as we can as possible. So that's all I wanted to add to that. So it's not all doom and gloom like Brendan says most of the time.
Yeah. Thanks for raising everybody's hopes. But in reality, everything Michael said is very true. We have worked very hard, and I just don't. I mean, I like I said, I'm an old finance guy, so I like to take things with a bit of reality. And then to make it even worse than that, I was a police officer at one point in time, so I have a really low sense of exactly what the truth is. And Mike said we've been, and he specifically, as well as some of our grant staff, have been very creative in what they can come up with to work in the ways that we need to work. But at the same time, I don't. There's not a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
Pessimist, optimist.
Yeah, but whose arm is in a sling? Yeah.
Still smiling.
Okay, and then the next question is more of a procurement question, and it's regarding the state of California and the availability of state contracts that will aid in procuring the needed narrow-banding capable equipment. So everybody must have been listening to Michael that there is money out there, so this is good, they want to procure. But the question is that they know that PSCO is working on obtaining a contract for VHF-based radios, but is not complete at this time, and it may force some of the state agencies to procure through less favorable means. And then they wanted to know if we were aware of this and if we were doing anything about that for alternative solutions. And I'm going to ask Bill Anderson to kind of fill this question. He gave me the answer earlier, and I have to apologize, I forgot my notes, so I know he's here.
Yeah, the contract is still at DGS procurement right now, or it should be, when I say at there, it's still out for bid and for award once the bids come back in again. I was trying to contact somebody this morning at procurement. Unfortunately, they got smart and went on vacation on me, so next week we'll try and get a better answer for that. As far as other ways of procurement, you're right. There's not a lot of options there. It's either using one of the existing contracts, such as WISCA, which may cost you a little bit more than what we get from competitive bidding on a state contract, or using an agency's delegation to go out and purchase equipment directly from the manufacturer. Those are basically the options you have right now.
And we do need to stay within the state procurement rules, so that is the options.
Yes, well, all of that stuff, any of those procurements would come through us anyway to make sure that this equipment is compliant.
Now, those were the two questions that we received in advance. Are there any questions that anyone out? Okay.
I do.
Okay. Paul,
I'm a
did you?
licensee, and this is for the FCC. And can I use the narrowbanding mandate? Can I use the narrowbanding mandate to, as a exemption for the ULS 90-day rule? I've got licenses across the narrowband plateau. I'll be wideband licensed to 2014 in a couple of them. What I want to do is I want to modify the license, renew them, get them narrowbanded, and clean them up. But the ULS won't let me without a waiver statement. Can I use narrowbanding as a waiver statement to renew licenses early and narrowband them?
In other words,
get new end dates past the narrowband limit.
Okay, so in other words, can you use the narrowbanding mandate itself as the basis for the waiver request?
Yes.
Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes.
I will need to take that one back to our licensing folks, just because I think I probably need to understand a little bit more about exactly the challenge that you're facing.
Well, you can't submit a renewal request unless you're licensed, unless you're within 90 days of the end of your license.
And what you want to do is
I want to
renew
license
early.
them all right now. That's, I'm stuck now
Okay,
in my narrowbanding plan because I can't access the ULS
I
to
understand.
renew a license and narrowband.
Okay, so I will need to take this back to our licensing folks because
That
then
would be a great help to a lot
Okay.
of the
No,
locals
that's-
that don't have a whole lot of time.
Okay. Because presumably, for us to do it, then we would have to manually process it. But if there is a benefit that both to you and to us in terms of being able to clean up the database sooner rather than later, I can see that as maybe something that we want to look into.
I'll
So
do it. Just let me use it as a waiver.
let me get your contact information
I
at
will.
the end of this, and I'll take that back. And then what we can also do is if it looks like this is something that we want to explore further, we can provide information through California and, other sources as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
David, another question directed to you.
He had his time. He had his time.
It's more of a policy question, more than anything. Obviously, you could tell that a lot of effort's going into meeting the mandate, resource-wise, money, you name it, whether they transition to a different band, get new equipment. Now, under the current what is it, the Broadband First Responders Act of 2011, HR, what is it, 607.
This is
Yeah,
the King bill.
Yeah, it's still obviously being discussed, but,
Yes.
and there's been a lot of support from public safety agencies, officials, and so forth. Now, there is a particular provision that was discovered in there, and
I know where
I
you're
see
going
you were
with this.
shaking your head.
I know where you're going.
Just for everyone's benefit, there's a provision in this act that says 8 years after the enactment of HR 607, public safety entities using radio spectrum in the 420 to 512 megahertz UHF band would have to move to alternative spectrum in the 700 to 800 megahertz band. Obviously, that's very discomforting for folks that are spending a lot of money and things only to find out 8 years later that they're going to have to move. So how does the FCC address, or what's their concern, or I guess their comments on that?
Well, I can answer that in a couple of ways. First of all, the bill you mentioned is just that. It's a bill that's been introduced in the House Homeland Security Committee. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it also involves the reallocation of the 700 megahertz D block for broadband purposes to public safety. And then, as you said, there's language in the bill that talks about migrating public safety off VHF and UHF spectrum over, is it an eight-year time frame? Yeah. So this is a piece of proposed legislation. It is not law. I don't know if it will ever become law. Nobody here knows if it will ever become law. Obviously, public safety has expressed concerns, and I'm sure they will continue to express concerns to members of Congress, and that process will play out. What I would say is we're dealing with the law that we have now, because our assumption is we deal with the law that we have now until we wake up one morning and Congress has changed it, if in fact they choose to change it. That's the world that we have to deal with. So we're dealing with the here and now, and we're moving ahead. I can say that if that legislation were to become law, I think we would be re-examining a whole lot of things with respect to these bans. But what I would say is that the concerns you raise really have to be part of the argument about the pros and cons of the bill. They're not something that we can take and have it affect our policy now, because we're dealing with a hypothetical. And we have to follow the law and the rules that are in place now.
So I will make a little point, because in this case, Michael actually brings up a great point. And I don't want to belabor it, but those of you in the room at a local level, the FCC obviously can't say this because it's a proposed bill. Peter King, those of you who don't know, is the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee. And in my experience, 16 years with both the California legislature and the federal government, the chairman of a committee very rarely does not get his bill to the floor and through the House. So those that are in the room with a vested interest in that may want to actually pay attention. Feel free to ask Michael for the bill number later. And I don't want to harp on it, but it is, I mean, when the committee chair proposes a bill, it makes it out of the committee, and in the House, it makes it all the way through the process, 9 out of 10 times. So any changes to any incremental in that bill will either have to be done if the chairman takes amendments and or in the Senate. So, it is still a long way away from being a law, but it is much closer than if, Joe Blow proposed it rather than the committee chairman.
Okay, were there any other questions relative to funding? Okay, we will move to the technical issues. I have 4 questions we received in advance. The first question is, for all intents and purposes, the VHF high-band spectrum in most of California is packed in as tightly as possible. Every frequency is either co-channeled or adjacent channel to another user within the interference range. Will narrow-banding VHF high-band really result in additional usable frequencies?
Is that one for me?
Sure.
Unless, I don't know, Preston, if you have a view on it, but.
I'll throw my nickel on the pile. The politicians that looked at rebanding says, aha, here's a way to double the number of channels available. We folk in the industry that own a little reality and know a lot about physics, it's not so. There will be channels gained, yes, but not to the quantity as envisioned just by the number 2.
And I would agree with that, and some of it will depend on where you are, but it is not a doubling of channels literally, and I think that's sometimes a popular misconception. I would say, though, there are other benefits to consider as well as just the additional channel capacity, because what we are doing is in some ways creating the basis for the use of more efficient technology. There will be instances where that can result in channel gains, but I think also it will result in better quality interoperability, less interference. And the other thing to consider is that, and again, this is not necessarily a direct consequence of narrowbanding, but there are a couple of indirect consequences. One is it does help spur a migration from analog to digital. Not everybody is doing it, but a lot of people are. That creates certain spectrum efficiencies that I think one can count as benefits. The other thing is that at the same time that the Commission began the narrowbanding proceeding, it also opened up the 700 and 800 megahertz bands. And a number of systems licensees have already migrated to those bands. And so some of those gains have already essentially been sort of given out early, even before the deadline. But there will be others that before the end of this process will likely migrate as well. And so that will also free up some spectrum. Because we expect that for those licensees that do choose to migrate to 700 and 800 megahertz, they will be giving spectrum back. And so some of that spectrum will also become available. So no, it's not a silver bullet that magically doubles everybody's spectrum capacity, but at the same time, there are, over the long haul, definite benefits to doing this.
I just realized that the snacks were brought into the room, and it's 2:35, so how about we take about a 10-minute break, and everybody can get the water, and then we can regroup. Okay, we're going to go back to the technical questions. The second technical question is it true that a service area may be less after the conversion to narrowband, and if so, why?
I think, if I understand the question, this is probably going to the coverage issue, the question of whether narrowbanding results in a loss of coverage. And I think Ken addressed that to some extent in discussing the experience of CAL FIRE. What I would say is best I understand it, and I have to predicate this with saying I'm not an engineer, so for the really accurate answer, we'll need to go back to the engineers in the Bureau. But my understanding is that based on conversations with vendors and others, that there is typically about a 3 dB loss. That's the number that's been given to me in coverage that's associated with the narrowbanding process. But there are a number of things that you need to really look at when you're looking at that coverage loss issue. I think what your experience, what Ken's experience highlighted for me is that it may be that one of the potential opportunities in narrowbanding is that it actually tells you a lot about the engineering of your system. And so that one of the things that you should do as part of it is to go and look at how your system is engineered, because it may be that even if there is a coverage loss, there are a lot of things that you can do with your existing system to compensate for that. We have heard from some licensees, particularly in rural areas where they have pretty much pushed the envelope in terms of their existing infrastructure in the wideband modes to get as much coverage as they can with as few sites as they can. That's usually where you will see a more significant impact that might require the addition of additional sites as part of the process. Again, what we recommend is this is part of the due diligence process, and it's what many licensees have had their vendors or consultants look at as a part of an engineering study, the technical study of what it is that's going to be required to narrowband. Because that's obviously a question that you want an answer to, and as good an answer to as possible before you actually start the conversion. So if there's a serious possibility that you're going to need to add sites, reconfigure sites, you know that in advance. But again, it depends on the specifics of the system, And in many instances, it may be that the loss of coverage is not that significant, or it can be addressed in other ways besides some kind of addition of sites or other major upgrade.
Okay, the third question, when will the requirement for 6 1/4 bandwidth criteria go into effect, and what bands are affected? And David addressed some of this in the presentation.
The latter part of the question, the 6 1/4 kilohertz requirement applies to the same bands that the 12.5 applies to. So what we're talking about is those same UHF and VHF channels. But as I said before, there is no deadline. And there will be no deadline established unless and until the FCC conducts a rulemaking process. But so before any decision would be made, there would be a proposal and an opportunity for public and public safety comment. I think the other thing I would just say as a general backdrop to it is we're dealing with a very different world now, 20 years after we started down this path in terms of what's happening with spectrum and the way spectrum is used. So I think one of the ways in which we look at future narrowbanding is in the larger context of what's going on with broadband. Is there going to be a migration, again, aside from whether there might, the legislative issue of whether there might be a forced migration, assume that we're not dealing with that. We're still dealing with an evolution where we anticipate, and I think many in the public safety community anticipate, that ultimately a lot of what is now being provided on narrowband channels will ultimately be provided on broadband, because broadband is where the technology is going, and so that's where the new technology that we will be using to replace existing systems increasingly will be found. Now, broadband is not yet capable of taking on all the functions for public safety of narrowband systems, because broadband, the standards are still being developed, and in particular, standards that would be adequate to support mission-critical voice, which obviously, if there's going to be a wholesale migration to broadband, that has to be part of the standard before that happens for public safety. We think that will happen. Don't know exactly how long it will take, but again, we think that that's going to be part of the general migration that we see. And that's going to influence our thinking about whether it makes sense to continue to go down the path of further narrowbanding, or whether we should really be devoting resources to going in a different direction.
Okay. And then the last of the questions that were submitted earlier, I'm going to read this as it's written because I'm afraid if I paraphrase or change it, I will lose the essence of the question. Once I narrowband my operations on my frequency, can I obtain a license for the interstitial frequencies above and or below my existing frequency?
And as I read that question, it may be that the assumption is, does the licensee, when a licensee narrowbands, do they have some sort of automatic right to the interstitial channels that are adjacent to the channel that they've narrowbanded? There's basically any spectrum that's freed up, any interstitial frequencies that are freed up, go back into the pool and would have to be coordinated in the normal process. So when you narrowband, it's not that you have some kind of predetermined right to the interstitial frequencies that are created. That just becomes part of the coordination process.
Okay, now were there any other technical questions?
Including questions for any of these other
Yes.
fine panelists.
He's doing a great job.
Just to add on to Sorry, but obviously, you would recommend that if an agency, once it's narrowband those interstitial channels, obviously it would be in their benefit to pursue those channels as quickly as possible.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. We'll move on to coordination issues. Sorry, David. First question. How will the FCC monitor the narrowbanding effort?
That's a very good question. We have been doing several things. The only information that we get at the FCC about directly about narrowbanding is what we see in the licensing database. The licensing database only gives us a partial picture of what's actually happening. So a big part of our focus has been on trying to improve situational awareness, as it were, of what's going on in the band by events like these, by outreach to public safety organizations, to interoperability coordinators, and to licensees to find out what is going on, and also to encourage licensees who have issues to come to us. There's also a lot of monitoring that's going on among the public safety organizations as well, and I think also many of the statewide interoperability offices, California's included, are keeping a very close eye on this issue, because again, it's a resource issue. It's not just a compliance issue, it's a resource issue. I would also recommend, DHS has developed a mapping tool that is actually derived from our licensing database, and I should have put the web address on it. Do you have it?
Yeah, I think most of our folks do have it. We were actually the beta state that.
Yes.
So that I showed you the great picture back in last.
It's a useful tool in Google Earth that allows you to drill into the licensing data but see it visually on a map, and it tells you what's, again, based on our licensing data, who has added the narrowband emission designator. Doesn't necessarily tell you who has narrowbanded or who's ready to, but at least it's an important data point. I also know that NIPSTIC has put out some surveys. I saw some results reported in the trade press that they were providing at IWCE. They've been asking their members for information on narrowbanding readiness. And we're trying to correlate a lot of that data in order to get a better understanding of are we on track, and if not, what do we need to make sure we get on track?
Okay. The next question. For a public safety operation that is not fully narrow-banded and interferes with another entity, what relief is available for the public safety operation?
It was a little unclear to me looking at that question whether they're talking about now or after 2013. Because, of course, after 2013, if you're not fully narrow-banded and you don't have a waiver and you're interfering with somebody, you have a problem. Now, in the current situation, the issue would always be, the first question is, are you operating in compliance with your license? If you're not fully narrow-banded before 2013, you're not out of compliance. But I think that the point to keep in mind in terms of 2013 is that the world gets a lot more difficult if you haven't met the deadline and you haven't taken the steps you need to take to protect yourself and you're causing interference.
Well, I'm starting to feel sorry for Dave a little bit. So an operational solution that we're invoking as part of our transition is that we're tone protecting our frequencies. Now, it won't obviously, so if you're a user and you're finding yourself impacted by some of these other folks, we're finding, when we used it before in other aspects, but we're increasing the tone protection on our frequencies so that we're not getting them errantly opened up by another user. And that's, again, as frequencies are compressed and pushed down and maybe being used by adjacent folks, that's a significant benefit for us to try to minimize some of that impact. So just from an operational perspective, if you have that capability, it may help protect from some of that.
Third question, is the service area, which I believe they mean coverage, for a frequency considered on a license-by-license basis, or is it considered as an overall system over many licenses giving a regional or statewide service area?
I guess I read that question as asking, first of all, about our licensing process itself. And I mean, in general, in these bands, we license on a station-by-station, frequency-by-frequency basis. There are instances where a system that has multiple sites and multiple channels may also have multiple call signs, and so, in fact, you have an aggregation of licenses that actually represent a single system. But from our point of view, as a licensing matter, it's still basically the component licenses that we use as the basis for our licensing. Preston, I don't know if that's an issue that is relevant in terms of coordination that maybe you want to address.
We do consider that when we do coordination at the head end of the process. For instance, if the city came to us and said, we need radio, we would look at the parameters and basically guide the thinking to where that radio system covers the city and not much more. We're forever getting requests for high-level sites to cover 3 square miles of a city because there's an itinerant 1 or 2 times a week trip into the county lockup. That we don't look favorably upon. We want to see the system serve 99% of the area where they're doing their work. Of course, if it's a county that we would evaluate. But it comes down to the basic 9205 provisions, where we establish the ERP, effective radiated power, of that new station to serve no more than a 32-kilometer area of operation if UHF, or a 40-kilometer area of operation if in the VHF band. The 800 and 700 rules are different.
Yeah, that was the other point I was going to add, is that this is a different a more kind of traditional licensing scheme, and what we've done at 700 and 800, as some of you may be aware, is those frequencies are coordinated and licensed through a regional planning process. So you have regional planning committees for both the 7 and the 800 megahertz band that help to allot the frequencies to different jurisdictions within each region.
Okay, the next question. How can we continue to update and modify our licenses for statewide frequencies and still maintain the use of wideband emissions until it's time to convert?
I think the answer to that is simply maintain your wideband emissions designator, which you can maintain. And then, as I said, we're anticipating at this point, we're looking at a process, and I think this also answers one of the later questions in this list, at the possibility of then having an FCC-centric process to delete the wideband emission designators at the end of the process, unless a licensee alerts us that we shouldn't do so for some particular reason, as opposed to doing it the other way and making everybody come in and file individual designations to eliminate the wideband.
Next question. The state is the licensee for most of the mutual aid interoperability frequencies. Although we hold the license, we have no control over the radios owned and maintained by local government agencies operating on those frequencies. What is our liability if a local government agency doesn't convert their radios to narrowband?
Well, the general rule of thumb is that a licensee is responsible for the radios, their own radios, the radios that are licensed to their system. So I don't think in this case, under this scenario, if a licensee is operating is operating infrastructure for mutual aid, that does not make them responsible for every unit that belongs to some other licensee, every mobile or portable that belongs to some other licensee that might use those frequencies. Now, there are questions, practical questions, about how will narrowbanding work, how are those mutual aid channels going to be narrowbanded, and how do you accommodate the fact that there may still be some wideband radios out there. And as a practical matter, it's an issue for any licensee. Again, it's another reason to narrowband, is that if you want access to those mutual aid channels after 2013, they're going to be narrowbanded. So you need to make sure that you're capable of using them. But I don't think under this scenario that the state would be liable for another licensee failing to narrowband the radios.
Okay, and that pretty much answered, I'll go ahead and read the next question, but David pretty much answered this next question as well. And it was, does the state need to document that the local government agency signs and returns to us certifying that the radios or radios are converted to narrowband operations, and I would believe that would be no.
Not for any FCC
No.
purpose. I mean, if there may be state coordination and management purposes where you might want that for your own protection, but it's certainly not an FCC requirement.
Right, and that would go back to just making sure we're communicating well and looking at our mutual
Exactly.
aid agreements.
Exactly.
Okay, the next question, on January 1, 2013, what happens to the wideband emission designators on the license? Will FCC automatically remove the wideband designator, or do we need to submit a modification request to have the wideband designator removed prior to January 1, 2013?
And that's the question that I just talked
Right.
about, and we'll be putting out a public notice when we make that decision. But I anticipate that we will, certainly our preference would be to have some type of automatic process. And that will also then take care of the tsunami.
Yes, I see
That's one of the
next
reasons.
one.
So, we don't like tsunamis.
Okay, that was all the questions that were submitted. Are there any additional questions, coordination, or otherwise that you wanted to ask the panel before we conclude? Jerry?
This question is for David, please.
Of course.
Sorry.
He's
And
a
press.
guy.
Earlier this afternoon, you said that if an agency decided to move to 700 megahertz, they would be giving up their VHF licenses, as an example. Is there any mandate to do that?
No.
No, there's no mandate to
An
do that. But, clearly anybody that just chose to migrate to 700 and continue to maintain their UHF and VHF is taking on some significant expense to maintain two systems. So we're expecting that in many cases, that's a migration where those channels will ultimately be given back. The other thing I would say is if that's the basis, if you're considering a migration, but it's going to happen after 2013, so you're going to come to us for a waiver and ask for a waiver, I would say that that waiver request would be looked on much more, if you want it to be looked on positively, it would probably be better to offer that at the end of the process, there will be channels that will be given back as part of that. Because then that's something else to put on the public interest side of the ledger in terms of favoring a grant.
Any other questions? Okay.
No?
I would like to go back to questions. Thank you. I would like to go back 2 questions to the person who is operating a wideband portable with wideband channels, and they're on a state license, and they're a city and somewhere in California, for example. What remedy, and let's say that they're operating on a wideband after 2013, and they're causing interference. What is the process that's going to be invoked? Would you come to the state and say someone is operating on this channel as FCC, or press, perhaps you know the answer to this? And in other words, we have no control really of a local using that frequency. We could tell them you no longer have rights to use that frequency, or you must use it in accordance with the FCC rules.
Well, typically, if you have, whether it's on a state channel or any other channel, if you have a wideband, if you have an unauthorized wideband operation after 2013, that can trigger an FCC enforcement process, which can happen a couple of ways. One is that somebody else comes in and complains about it, in which case we would investigate it and could take action. We also have the ability unilaterally, if there are licensees that are out of compliance, to take that action as well. So I think that either way, the issue is whether it's appropriate for FCC enforcement processes to be invoked at that point. And certainly if you're coming at the issue from the vantage point of a state who's trying to deal with some other entity that's out of compliance, then certainly the state would be well within its rights to come to us to seek that redress.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, I hope this was helpful for all of you today and answered some of your questions. I think you've got some contacts that if you have additional questions based on today, that you know who to reach out to. I'd like to thank our panel members, David Firth, Kim Pimlott, Brandon Murphy, and Preston Thompson. It was really nice having all of you here, and thank you so much, David, for coming from DC for this. We really centered this around FCC, to be really honest.
I know.
So
Happy to do it, though.
So I appreciate you fielding all the questions and taking the time for us in California.
Happy to do it, and I look forward to coming back.
Thank you, everyone.